Hello and welcome to the forum. I'm John Matisonn. We have three especially interesting guests today, and the first is Wandile Sihlobo, who's going to be talking to us about land reform and agriculture. Then we'll be talking to Brent Meersman about press freedom in South Africa. And finally, we'll be having our last discussion before the US presidential election next week. My first guest, Wandile, is an agricultural economist who's been making waves. He grew up in the Eastern Cape, first went to the University of Fort Hare, then to Stellenbosch, where he did a master's degree. He's a member of President Ramaphosa's Economic Advisory Council and the Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture. He writes a column in Business Day and just brought out a book called Finding Common Ground, based on his writings. Wandile, welcome to the forum.
Thanks for having me on, John.
Wandile, your book gave me hope. Not only because there are solutions, I've always believed there were solutions, but because you find them and you give answers. We'll talk about cannabis or dacha, we'll talk about Zimbabwe land reform, blueberries, why Kenya beats us in avocado or exports later. But let's first talk about land reform. How much has happened in South Africa since 1994, and how much of it has been successful?
Yeah, I think, John, the picture could be judged in really different mirrors in there. I think overall, the government has somewhat been good at acquiring some of the land, but I think where it has been slacking is really releasing the land that it has acquired to beneficiaries and making sure that those beneficiaries either have title deeds or either have long-term tradable leases. And we do see that even now with more recent events that are not in the book, the 700,000 hectares that government is beginning to say they are releasing that land to be out to new beneficiaries. And I think that in as far as the numbers, as the progress to say where are the patterns of land ownership looking like in South Africa, and where is the progress onto that? I think that we misjudge that picture, and part of it is also the fact that we don't have good data in South Africa on who owns what. But according to the numbers that we have at the University of Stellenbosch and Pretoria, where we worked on with Professor Kirsten, we do think that if you're looking at the 122 million hectares of South Africa, agriculture forms about 7,700 million hectares of that. And on that, we think that roughly 20% right now is sitting with the Black South Africans. Some bought through government, some private purchases. It's not the 9% that we tend to take a much more pessimistic view, John. I think there has been some bit of progress, but obviously there's still room to progress more.
But yes, and I think you've also indicated there were mistakes and slowdowns that were really unfortunate. So in a way, you could argue that we needed a bomb put under us to speed the process up, which the economic freedom fighters provided. But you say that their idea, which is nationalization of the land, will cause more problems than it'll solve.
Yeah, I think, John, many people tend to underappreciate the complexities of the South African economy at large, and also where the land patterns are actually looking like.
Right.
Going on and nationalizing or expropriating, I think it would undermine a lot of investments that are in there in the sector. And John, as you know, agriculture in South Africa is capital intensive. Right. We just saw, for example, the new numbers that were coming out this week, showing that farm debt is tapering just under 200 billion rands alone. But now when you're dealing with nationalization, you're dealing with a lot of the other assets that are bonded within the land, but also the sentiment issue that will play in. So that's not the avenue to really take with all of its complexities and the examples that we have seen in neighboring countries and elsewhere.
So, I mean, part of what you're arguing, as I understand it, is that if you don't own the land, you can't get capital, you can't borrow from banks.
That's when then joint government needs to come in and saying their beneficiaries that they're giving the land, they need to give them the long-term tradable leases or the title deeds. It's going to be important for seeing success to the new landowners.
Now, you've proposed a solution. You think there is a way to speed up land reform?
There's various avenues, John. Land Reform Fund is one of that, and that we had presented even to Cabinet through the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture. But also there's land donations policy. We had churches and mining companies and such, and some of the major farmers saying they want to donate certain pieces of land. And we're happy now that government is taking heed onto that, and there is legislative work that is being done in there. But we do think that the Land Reform Fund would be the most important one, because we could pull capital from various people and still be able to come in the market and acquire some of the land and use these various instruments to build the supply of land, then to distribute to new beneficiaries.
Now, you've referred to some of the farmers willing to give up land, as well as mining companies and governments. To what extent is there a genuine willingness by white farmers to give up land, to give support, and to do other things? Because at least some farmers understand that they don't have peace if there isn't a redistribution of land.
Yeah, that's pretty much, John, the sentiment and the messaging that we're getting. I mean, we walk around the country, talk to farmers throughout, and they understand the risks. They understand that the inequality on the land patterns is going to cause a social destabilization one way or another. And they are willing to say, how do we then subdivide some or certain pieces on this land and give it either to some of their workers or somebody that they know who's in their community, who they think that those people could actually be able to participate in agriculture. So there is a willingness.
Is it correct to say that up to now, the farmers or up till recently, shall we say, farmers and government were sort of talking past each other? They weren't connecting, and where there was goodwill, there weren't solutions. And to what extent has that changed now under President Ramaphosa?
No, that is 100% correct, John, because we weren't really all speaking and focusing on the same thing. I think now what the President Ramaphosa's approach has been helpful on is this whole story of a social compacting and making sure the Department of Agriculture works with organized agriculture even more closely so that we can all be able to solve problems on a sectorial basis, even outside agriculture and other industries. So I think that social compacting has been very helpful on making sure that the dialogue is productive.
Are you now satisfied that things have speeded up, that the government is moving fast enough, and that we'll get some real results?
I think, John, there's still a lot of improvement that could be done. Yeah. For me, the release of the land so far is a positive step. Doing the beneficiary selection criteria so that the right person who can utilize the land productively are the ones that benefit, not those with largely political connections. We've seen such corruptions in the past. And also the looking at the blended finance instruments, and also exploring some of the private sector initiative. I think all of those in the medium to long term, we will begin to yield some fruits of those efforts.
I want to just ask one quick question about urban housing and urban use of land, because you've commented on it briefly. I did some work for a book I wrote where I was talking to property developers in Durban who said there's scope in Durban and in other cities. Durban, for example, for 500,000 residents that are not there. Have you also seen that there's a potential that's not being acted on in the urban areas?
Yeah, I mean, John, we have made a mistake in South Africa to agriculturalize land reform. But I think that there is a much more serious need in urban. I mean, you saw it more acutely at this time when we were, as a nation, saying people should social distance, go homes, and people really can't social distance in other communities. And this goes back to, say, the issue of housing, human settlement in South Africa. That, I think that's where there's really what people call land hunger is in. And in those areas, I mean, mining companies, some of the land they want to donate is closer to residential areas and also churches. And there's element of land that is also owned by the state-owned entities, which I think in the new expropriation bill, which recently came out about 2 weeks ago, it offers a state an avenue to be able to address such cases of the surplus land sitting with the SOEs. So that's an important area. And there's an advocate and workmen's attorney, Bulelwa Mabasa. She's doing serious work on that area. But certainly it is an important part of land reform.
Before we go to the break, I want to ask you quickly about Zimbabwe. I noticed from your book, you say that the claims that Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa was a great exaggeration. But on the other hand, you do seem to say that Zimbabwe's production of food was made it self-sufficient until the big land change in the early 2000s, 20 years ago. And since then, food production has gone down in Zimbabwe quite significantly, and it's a food importer.
Yeah, I mean, that's correct, John. In the 80s or so, throughout, even before Mugabe came into power, Zimbabwe was doing relatively well. But the essay was really to caution on this issue of saying Zimbabwe was feeding the continent, as the late President Mugabe claimed. I think he was taking that optimism too far onto that. But it's quite right that from year 2000 up until to today, those land reform policies that were put in place were really ill-conceived, and the people of Zimbabwe are still suffering as a result of that. There's not serious investments that is going on agriculture. Productivity plummeted, infrastructure has also been hammered, and some of the people with the know-how in the farming sector left the industry. So it's really, and I think there is a major macroeconomic issue also that erupted from there. And that gives us an example or play out of the cautionary tale, if one may, for South Africa to say these are things that we need not to look for. We really need to look at meaningful situations because we don't want to see ourselves in that situation. It's a painful stuff that is happening in Zimbabwe.
We're going to take a break, but when we come back, I'm going to ask Wandile about the optimistic ideas he has for better farming, more productive farming, and job-creating farming in South Africa. We'll be right back. And we're back talking to Wandile Sihlobo, who is an agricultural economist who works with the President's team on fixing our agriculture and land reform problems. Wandile, when you look at farming since 1994, I'm starting with the negative question, we've lost jobs, haven't we, in farming?
Yeah, we've lost jobs, John, at a high level, but that was due to a number of things. Technology having played part onto that. We now, for example, sitting with roughly, with COVID, just around about 776,000 people working in agriculture. Before COVID, we were just north of 850,000 people. But if you look back in history, we had jobs in agriculture north of 1 million. So the adoption of technology, as farms got bigger and productivity and competitiveness became a key thing to chase, we've seen some people fall off on the jobs ladder.
Now, the other point you made that I found very interesting, it seems logical, but I hadn't heard it said by politicians, is that we have quite a lot of arable land in South Africa, which is underutilized or not utilized, especially, you mentioned, I think, in the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal and Limpopo, or poor areas that desperately need jobs.
Yeah, I mean, John, it makes sense for us to focus on those areas. I mean, if you look at the poverty levels, those are the provinces that are really in experiencing a tough time. And I do think that looking at what industries can really bring economic activity in the near term for people of those communities, I think agriculture is one of those. And from an agribusiness perspective, my employers and many people in our network that we talk to, they really are hungry to go to those areas and participate there. But I think that, John, links back to our previous discussion of saying, how do we deal with land governance? How do we deal with infrastructure so that those areas could truly be meaningful agricultural contributors?
And do you see a movement in that area? Are we going to actually see that arable land being properly used?
I think, John, our persistence in repeating that message over and over, it's now finally receiving warm ground, both on the policymakers, but also just to private citizens who are looking for areas of investments. As I speak to you now, John, there is what is called government sector master plans that are being developed by various departments. And when the agricultural one comes out, you will quite see that it is what it's called commodity corridors, which many of them cuts through these areas of the Eastern Cape, Natal, and going up also into Limpopo, where I think that maybe this time around we might get things right. And I think the broader infrastructure fund project also that the presidency is leading speaks to some of the infrastructure needs that some of those communities are facing. So I think over time, medium term, we could actually see something changing in those areas, because they are really what I called the frontiers for agricultural expansion in South Africa.
Right. Well, just while you mention infrastructure, I know the president is talking about an infrastructure, spending substantial infrastructure. It's very much needed, and if it's correctly done, it's very job creating. So are you optimistic that we'll get the right kind of infrastructure, ports, rail, and so on, that will stimulate agricultural and other industries?
I think, John, we will get those. I'm fairly optimistic. The colleagues that are leading that work at the presidency, when you look up on their messaging, look up at the reports they put out, I think they're diagnosing the situation fairly correct. As soon as we see funds flowing in, we should be able to see that progress.
Now, I want to move on to cannabis or dagga. This is something that has really been a great boon to countries like Canada, Australia, and so on. But we're slow. We've been behind. I mean, even Lesotho has been ahead of us. And this is something that could be really a case where black farmers have the advantage.
Yeah, I think, John, it's a shame that we have seen many countries overlapping onto that. Because as you and I will know, that there's a lot of anecdotal stories that we have heard, and many people, even more so like myself, who are coming from the Transkei area, of really anecdotal stories of this being grown in the shadows of the law. Absolutely. As you go to stuff, Lusiki, Port St. John's. We should have really thought about instruments of saying, how do we commercialize this, making sure that it's not abused, it's done for what can bring value to those communities, but for the economy at large. But what I'm happy about, John, again, to my previous point, when you look at those commodity corridors that government is putting in place, you will see that cannabis and hemp is actually amongst those commodities that are putting in place. So South Africa is finally moving.
Right. So, of course, cannabis has medicinal purposes. It also has recreational purposes. But the hemp component can be extremely useful for textiles.
It can be extremely useful for textile and also brings a great value, John. I mean, you think about China, for example, last year, I mean, the revenue that they generated out of there is north of $2 billion US. That's a lot. That's money that is almost equal to what South Africa is trying to get from the World Bank and elsewhere. So that's serious capital that we can get from the hemp industry, not to mention the jobs and economic activity in those communities where this could potentially be produced.
Well, that is hopeful. Now, I was interested to read because, farming is not my natural area of expertise. But you talk about a lot of products that we're not really exploiting in a way we could, and that have great job creating potential, labor intensive. You mentioned blueberries and certain other kinds of fruits that can be labor intensive and that have real export markets and that we haven't really exploited yet.
Yeah, I think, John, as we begin to think about agriculture as part of a broader economic development, and also thinking about it from a job perspective. We have to look into the sector to say, where can we get higher job multipliers if we really are going to invest in agriculture? And those areas that you've just mentioned, the entire horticultural sector is one of the promising ones. And what's more important is that those areas are not only just job intensive, but they also high value, and there's also a strong demand for them in the global market as people want to eat healthier and remain in good shape. So they're really consuming a lot of those. And I think South Africa, if we are to expand in Eastern Cape, KZN, and elsewhere, our first priority should be to really say, farmers, can you explore first as your priority and even put incentives for these labor-intensive industries? And I think that's what government should be doing. And I think that they are listening and hearing that message quite clearly.
Right. Now, just to make sure we don't get complacent, I also noticed, I mean, what I liked about your book and your writings and your comments is that you're very frank. You're optimistic about what we can achieve, but you're frank about where we're behind the curve. For instance, Kenya is ahead of us in avocado export, and they learned from us, and we got behind. What happened? Why did we get behind, and why is Kenya doing better than us?
I think, John, one of the things that we need to do is to push aggressively also on the export side. As much as we are putting emphasis on the production side, we need the same level of zeal for growing exports. Because one thing we have to always remember, as you know, is that agriculture, about 50% of what we produce actually goes to export markets. So if you're going to increase production by any level, you need to make sure that there is demand for that. And I think that South Africa, Minister Patel is really now also appreciating that message. We can see his efforts on what's happening on citrus and elsewhere. And I think that as we're going to be broadly expanding to some of the areas, trade will be an important part of that debate.
Yes. The one area that I noticed that I felt correctly warned us against was biofuels. Biofuels was experimented, but it's not really a success. And I mean, from what I've read in other countries, biofuels, which was supposed to be a way of reducing our carbon emissions, often doesn't even reduce carbon emissions because it takes so much petrol to produce the biofuels that are supposed to save us carbon emissions.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of complications, John's, there, because we wanted in South Africa to experiment using sorghum, and issues about the pricing onto that were a lot of complications. But what's now even more, at least uplifting, is that within the sugar industry, there is that discussion to say, can something be done onto that? And I think that on a pricing wise, looking at sorghum and looking at sugar, perhaps sugar will be more an effective option to go after. And that's something that is clear also on the sugar master plan. But obviously we will see what the next couple of months and years actually have for us in store in as far as that is concerned. But suffice to say, the colleagues that are in that industry, in the sugar industry, they pretty much are excited about these prospects. So we'll see what happens there.
I want to finish with the sort of two questions in one. One is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which has the potential for us to be shifting our export markets into Africa, because we've done mostly in Europe, I believe. Is that going to happen? Is it going to happen soon? How fast are we moving towards a really efficient agricultural sector?
Yeah, I think, John, if you were to look at South Africa's agricultural exports in value terms, for example, they're roughly about $10 billion US. And about 40% of that has been going to the African continent. Oh. And then you have Europe being the second. But now, John, within that 40% that goes to the African continent, 80% of it is concentrated within the SADC area.
Right.
It's few countries outside like Nigeria and the likes. Now, to the topic that you are bringing in, it's very important because what that does now, it begins to offer us an opportunity to go with very low tariff or tariff-free to some of the markets beyond the SADC region. Obviously, near term, the infrastructure constraints and a couple of glitches will still play part, particularly non-tariff barriers. But I think that long run, as we're looking at building regional value chain, this is an important step for the continent. And I think that it could pay off in the long run for South African agriculture and agro-processing and other industries.
Wandile, thank you so much for your time. It was really inspiring talking to you. I encourage people to read your book, Finding Common Ground, and I look forward to being in touch with you again in the near future.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back. And we're back. On the forum, my guest is Brent Meersman. He grew up in Cape Town. He went to Rhodes University. He's written 7 books. His latest is called A Childhood Made Up. But he's a familiar name to many people in South Africa. You'd have seen his work in the Mail and Guardian and elsewhere. He's lately been in the news because he's chairperson of the Cape Town Press Club. But he's also co-editor of Ground Up, which is a Cape Town-based, widely viewed news site that focuses on the side of South Africa you don't often see. He's also been on the edge of the fights for press freedom. Brent, welcome to the forum.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Brent, we'll talk about your book in a moment, but my first question to you is, what is the state of media freedom in South Africa now? It seems to be odd. I mean, there's a good part and a bad part.
Well, I think that we've certainly got our challenges, and I think that many of those challenges are of our own making and are not necessarily legal restrictions on us. I think that there's problems with the financial models. I think that it's not necessarily encouraging the best of journalism. I think that there is, I'm afraid to say, I think a certain amount of corruption has filtered in. It does seem that a lot of talented journalists very soon become spokespeople and move into government. So there's that kind of dynamic working as well. There's been various operations, orchestrated misinformation and disinformation operations at a very high level, we think. So one has to be extremely careful out there and check one's facts. I think compared to many places, though, we are a hell of a lot more free and better off. Limitations on voices in terms of the media ownership, as I mentioned. Yeah, and then we've got some worrying pieces of legislation. So there's, the new hate speech laws and various other things. I mean, we can debate those, but I think that they do crimp freedom of expression. Certainly the key installations that act as well, which nobody really noticed, that does limit us to report. A lot of the access to information requests, that process, PI is not exactly always functional. There are too many ways to dodge it. And then we have sitting in the president's drawer the state information, the secrecy bill. And that hasn't been signed into law, but it's passed.
Yes, but also, I mean, hasn't it been a more immediate problem that the police haven't always treated journalists appropriately?
Not at all. They're definitely not. And we saw some shocking things happening during the COVID lockdown. But of course, we can very quickly make the story about us. It wasn't just us that were being brutalized or being suppressed, but all kinds of people were, and even ordinary citizens taking out their telephone, not necessarily journalists, would get very harsh treatment indeed. I do think that when the media is there, that things sometimes do change, and people are aware that they're being filmed. So we do have some kind of role there. But yes, there's a lack of regard and there's a hostility. But there's also a hostility to journalists, which can come right from the grassroots. And I don't think that that's anything new in South Africa, and it's nothing new in our history. I mean, I remember, I was briefly a press photographer in Grahamstown then in the 1980s. And we were chased not only by the comrades, we were also chased by the police, both threatening our lives. So that kind of behavior, one must expect and one can live with it.
Brent, I want to ask you a little bit about Ground Up. What is the gap that you fill? Because you play an interesting role with the decline of a lot of our conventional media. Ground Up is, I know you've had big audiences during COVID-19. What is it that you're telling the public on your website that they wouldn't get elsewhere?
Well, I think why Ground Up came into being was we were very keenly aware that the lived experiences of millions of South Africans and things that really mattered to millions of people and things around social justice, socio-economic rights, human rights were not being covered adequately by the mainstream. There was such a focus on the macroeconomics and the macro politics and the big political debates and celebrity culture, all the things that make the media, what it is generally in the kind of society that we live. And there were so many untold stories which we thought were of extraordinary importance, but they just weren't actually being told, like the experience of commuters on trains. I used to refer to things as we used to get the traffic report. So the mainstream media would report that there was a protest, the N2 was blocked, police cars were there, a bus was torched, stones were thrown, and at 2:00 the road is now open. But right. Who were the protesters? How did that protest come about? What were their names? Where were they from? How long had they been struggling to get the tin ear of government? None of that was being reported. So they were just traffic reports. So, and that's how we started and why we started. So we started reporting on all those kind of issues. And I think we've had an influence. I think things have shifted. I think that people became more and more aware. And I've definitely noticed that we took the lead, and I think a lot of people have followed us, and a lot of people with much bigger resources than we have. So it was quite amazing, I think, when the COVID-19 hit us and we went into the lockdown. All of a sudden, ENCA briefly turned into YouTube, running videos of people's lockdown antics, their home videos. Right. Then they pulled back to news after a while. But SABC, ENCA, and Newsroom Africa all started reporting the kind of stories that Ground Up had been doing for about 7 years already. Right. And because of simple things like water, having soap, being able to go to a toilet, having a room, actual space, if you're living in a shack with 10 people, these suddenly became a matter of a health emergency. And they were no longer a matter of dignity and comfort and popcorn protests. And so, it was intriguing to see that suddenly got reported. Suddenly that was front page news, the kind of things which were not always gaining the limelight.
I need to, we're going to run out of time all too quickly. I want to ask you, you're chair of the Cape Town Press Club. That's something that anybody can join. But what role is the Cape Town Press Club playing?
Well, first of all, it's one of the Cape Town institutions. I mean, it's 45 years this year that it's been running. So it's got a formidable history of speakers. Everybody from, Nelson Mandela, Jacob Zuma spoke there 3 times, in fact. All the presidents, I think, except for Thabo Mbeki. We've had, we've really had an extraordinary history. And it is this strictly non-partisan platform for engagement with the media. Yes, you're right. Anybody can join, but they are associate members. Only journalists can join as full-time members. So people, not full-time, I mean as full members.
Am I correct in thinking that both Ground Up has had an increased audience under COVID-19 and also the Press Club, because people can watch you virtually from all over the world?
Yes, we were, absolutely. So that was one of the strange things about it. Yes, suddenly the Press Club, so we weathered the COVID. We went into a series of webinars. I think we've done 10 events since we found our feet around about April, May, when we realized that this was going to be the state of things for some time. And yes, we can reach a much bigger audience, and the speaker doesn't necessarily have to be in Cape Town. In fact, the first one I did, we had a speaker in Singapore. I had a producer in Cape Town, and I was elsewhere. So we sometimes 3 or 4 cities. Of course, we've got to coordinate that around load shedding, which becomes very complicated.
Yes. Well, of course, we have that opportunity here at the forum as well to be interviewing people from all over the world. Before we run out of time, I wanted to ask you about your book, A Childhood Made Up. It's quite an extraordinary story. You talk about growing up with a mother who was schizophrenic, but also was an artist of real quality. And when I saw some of the paintings in the book, I was astonished. But she never had the courage to go out and get to galleries and get shown, which was a great pity, because during her lifetime, her art wasn't recognized.
Yes, thank you, John. Yes, she was a remarkable talent. Because of her schizophrenia, she, as you say, was never a commercial success, and she never had formal training as well. I think, for me, I think she was more talented than Maggie Loebscher, to be, frank. But for a woman artist, if you think about it, that was another, not just her mental condition, but also as a woman. It was very, very difficult. I mean, if you think about it, you can name about 3, Irma Stern, Maud Sumner, that's about it. There's very few women artists coming out of the 1970s in South Africa that really made a big name. So she had those difficulties as well, a very male world dominated by male gallery owners and critics. So it was difficult for her. But I did do an exhibition of her work after she passed away, and it was a huge success. And I think about 70 works were sold. Yes, and I still have quite a few of her works.
Right. And finally, is this a book that I see that certain psychoanalysts have commented on it, that they see it as a useful book for people to read to understand the impact of schizophrenia?
Yes, I think so. I mean, my primary motivation for writing it was because I looked around. I always knew I had the story and I wanted to tell it sometime. And when I thought I was a good enough writer to do it, I would. And it's a story that isn't often told. So there are accounts by people with schizophrenia. There are not many, because it requires, obviously you have to have insight into your condition. And even if you have insight into it, you don't necessarily know how to articulate that. So there certainly are a few accounts, but there are even fewer accounts by the children of a parent with schizophrenia. And I found that very much missing from the literature. So that was one motivation. The other motivation was that I think schizophrenia is very much misunderstood. And I've seen very few accurate or worthwhile depictions of it. And even highly acclaimed films like A Beautiful Mind and that really get it terribly wrong. And they always go down the same sensational avenues. And people confuse it with dissociative disorder. They think it's multiple personalities, and schizophrenia has nothing to do with multiple personalities.
Brent, we're going to have to leave it to the reader to decide for themselves. But I'm very glad to have you on. I think you're a very interesting Cape Townian, and I'm glad to introduce you to a wider audience. Thanks for being here with us, Brent. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about the US election. And we're back on the forum. My guest is Millard Arnold, former Special Representative of the United States in South Africa, also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, and a friend of the show who's been on the show before and has written several books or edited books on Steve Biko. Millard, welcome back.
Thank you, John. Good to be back.
So this is our last show before the election. When you were on before, you talked about the African-American turnout being significant, and if they came out for Biden, it could have a meaningful impact on the outcome. It looks like you were right.
Yeah, I think that's the case. If you look at the states, and we may go into this a bit later, if you look at some of the states that really made a difference in this election in 2016 in favor of Trump, take, for instance, Michigan. Trump won Michigan, the state of Michigan, by 11,000 votes only, 11,000. In the city of Detroit, the biggest city in Michigan, 277,000 blacks did not vote. That staggers the imagination. 277,000 did not vote. If they had voted, Michigan would have gone to Hillary Clinton. If you take Georgia, Trump won that state by 211,000 votes. In the city of Atlanta alone, 530,000 blacks did not vote. We can look at each of the swing states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida as well, and those same kinds of statistics show themselves. With the kind of turnout we're seeing right now, the voter turnout and the sense of this being the most important election that many people have seen in years, I don't think we're going to see the lagging numbers of blacks voting as we did in 2016. So there alone, I think it makes a difference.
So do you think then that, how confident are you that Joe Biden is on the way to beating Donald Trump?
Far more comfortable than I was in 2016 when it was Hillary and Trump. And the reason I'm comfortable is that if you look at the 2016 election, Hillary won 232 votes, electoral votes.
Right.
232. Those were all blue state votes. Every one of those states are going to go to Biden. There is no state, no blue state, that will be flipped by Trump.
Right.
So Biden starts already with a 232-point lead, electoral point, college lead, and needing only 38 votes to win. Let's look at Trump. Trump won, if you look at all the red states that are out there right now that are solidly Trump states, that gives him 206 votes in the Electoral College. He needs 64 to win. Of the 206, however, at least 3 of those states are contested: Arizona, North Carolina, and Georgia. Those states could swing. They could be flipped, leaving him with, if I'm not mistaken, about 164 votes that are guaranteed. So where will Trump or Biden get the remaining votes that they require? And that will come from the so-called swing states: Michigan, that we mentioned already, Florida, Georgia, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Of those states, Trump is behind in every single one by a huge margin. And when he did win in 2016, he carried Michigan by 0.2%. He carried Pennsylvania by 0.7%. He carried Wisconsin by 0.8%. Those 3 states alone gave him 46 electoral votes, and that's what was required. Those 3 states are almost certainly going to go toward Biden in this election. So I don't see a path forward for Trump to win this election because Florida is a big state and he could carry Florida, but that would only bring him up to 206, just make that 240. And I don't see where else he's going to gain the necessary states if he cannot carry Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, not to mention Georgia if he loses it. So yes, I'm confident that Biden will win.
And on the day and the ensuing days after the election, do you see a messy end game, or will it be calm?
No, it'll be messy. There's no doubt. I mean, everything about Trump's behavior from the day he won the election in 2016 until tonight has been chaos and controversy. So the notion that he might declare himself the winner on election night is probably in play.
Regardless of what the real outcome is.
Regardless of the real outcomes. And there will be any number of electoral challenges, both at state and federal level, that will go on for any number of times. Will probably go on until well after the election, well after inaugural day in some instances. And then finally, I suspect that there will be attempts at unrest, intimidation, and violence at the poll. Corey Goldstone, who runs something called the Campaign Legal Center, has said that there is likely to be intimidation and violence in 5 states. And of those 5 states, 3 of them, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, are swing states. So we can expect to see some kind of unrest, some kind of disturbance in any of those states, plus others. So will it be simply an acceptance of the fact that he's lost? No.
Do you think if Biden does win, and if he is able to pull the Senate his way, and Democrats win the Senate, do you think that the Democrats will be tougher on the Republicans than they were under Obama? Because when Obama came to power as president, he felt he could be a reconciler, and he tried to work with the Republicans. Do you think this time, I know Biden will try to work with the Republicans, but if the Republicans resist, do you think he will be tough?
Well, I don't know whether tough is the right word I would use. I think one of the things that's going to come out of this election, and you asked me, was I confident about it, was that the factors that will govern how this election turns out will be obviously race, gender, age, and education. And I don't see Trump having an advantage in any of those 4 categories. And the most important one may well be age on both sides of the equation. As a consequence of the pandemic, many senior citizens have felt their lives threatened by the lack of response from the federal government and the fact that they can't get into hospitalization and things of that nature. On the youth side, no one's talked much about that. But I think if you look at the Sanders primary campaign, the progressive movement for Bernie Sanders was enormous, and that was largely a young generation. So if you look at the protests that were taking place in the streets, not just about Black Lives Matter, but in general, there was a mixed group of folk out there. So on both sides of the age category, I see that going toward Biden. So I really feel that when you look at age, again, education, race, and gender, it's a slam dunk for Biden.
Before we run out of time, what does it mean for South Africa? I mean, my sense is that Trump really neglected the multilateral institutions, the UN, the G20, all the bodies that matter to South Africa. They're often inefficient and flawed, but they do have advantages for South Africa. They give South Africa a seat at the table. If Biden comes in, the Democrats are back, they're going to revive the importance of these institutions, and that's got to be good for South Africa, hasn't it?
Well, I think so, but we have to be cautious here, because if Biden wins the election, the damage that the Trump administration has done to the institutions, both in the United States and abroad, is going to take a serious amount of time to repair. Just to refocus the State Department, to look at Treasury, to look at any number of U.S. institutions that would impact on our global relationships is going to take time. Secondly, I think Biden's initial reaction will be to try and deal with both the pandemic and the consequences, the economic consequences that have flown from the pandemic, which has put the American economy on hold. So his focus is going to be initially on trying to repair what is damage that's been done, and then to reassert America in terms of the health pandemic and rebuild the economy. So I think South Africa, unfortunately, will not be a high priority. It will certainly be a priority, certainly much more so than what we saw under Trump. I've mentioned this before. I think one of the things that would be great to see the Biden administration do is to appoint someone to the Africa Continental Free Trade, the African Free Trade Agreement. Because that is going to be a game changer in Africa, and the administration could play a very constructive role in assisting the development of the free trade agreement. So I think, yes, there will be an emphasis on Africa and the rehabilitation of our relationships with international institutions will be important. But there's also a genuine understanding from Biden and the team around him about Africa, and in particular, South Africa. So I'm optimistic about how that's going to play out.
Millard, I wish we had more time, but that's a nice optimistic note to end on. That was Millard Arnold, and that's the end of our show. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll be back next week to watch the forum. I'm John Matisonn.